So what is aperture? Hi everyone, so let's start with some basics. We're going to be talking about the exposure triangle of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, which are highly important to understand for each element and the relationship with one another in photography. Today, I want to talk to you about aperture in photography and how it affects the look of an image. The aperture is the size of the opening in the lens of your camera, and it controls the amount of light that enters your camera. Aperture is measured in f-stops, and it can range from a very small opening to a very large opening. Think of it like the human eye. The smaller the f-stop, the larger the opening, and the more light that can enter your camera. A bigger aperture will produce a brighter image, while a smaller aperture will produce a darker image. The aperture also affects the depth of field of your image. A large aperture will produce a shallow depth of field, while a smaller aperture will produce a deeper depth of field. A shallow depth of field will make the background of your image look blurry. We call that bokeh, while a deeper depth of field will make the background of your image look sharper. When deciding which aperture to use, it's important to consider the effect that each aperture size will have on your image. A smaller aperture, i.e. a higher f-stop number, will create a greater or larger depth of field, meaning that more of the image will be in focus. This is usually ideal when photographing landscapes or other scenes that you want to capture in full detail, such as architecture. A larger aperture, or that means a lower f-stop number, like f1.4, will create a shallower depth of field, making it easier to separate your subject from the background and create a more artistic look. This is great for portrait photography and other images where you want to draw attention to a specific subject and separate them from the background. It's also useful to use this if your background is very cluttered and you want to blur it out so that your subject pops out even more. The minimum aperture of a lens is determined by the maximum f-stop number. So when you're looking for a lens to buy, the maximum f-stop number is indicated by the number that follows the f on the lens. For example, a lens with a maximum f-stop number of f22 would have a minimum aperture of f22. Generally, the higher the f-stop number, the smaller the aperture, and therefore the greater the depth of field. Just as an aside, pinhole camera uses a very small aperture, which means that a lot of the image is in focus. And if you think about the human eye, when you're outside and it's very bright, your iris will stop down so it becomes a smaller hole, allowing less light into the image. And usually this is useful if you want to see landscapes and you can see much further away. The minimum f-stop number is indicated by the number that follows the f on the lens. For example, a lens with a minimum f-stop number of f2.8 would have a maximum aperture of f2.8. Generally, the lower the f-stop number, the larger the aperture, and therefore the shallower the depth of field. So again, if the aperture is larger and the f-stop number is smaller, it means that your depth of field is shallower, and that allows for less of the image to be in focus, which usually means that your background is usually blurrier, and we call this bokeh. So to summarize, aperture is the size of the opening in the lens of your camera, and it affects the brightness of your image and the depth of field. A larger aperture will produce a brighter image and a shallower depth of field, while a smaller aperture will produce a darker image and a deeper depth of field. So here are some images that show you kind of what the aperture does and how it affects the look of an image. As you're looking through the images, check out how the larger aperture or larger f-stop will affect the background of the image and how much of your image is in focus. Now, what you're not seeing in those images was how the shutter speed and ISO had to change alongside the changing aperture in order to maintain the same exposure. We'll go into more detail in a future video about the relationship between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. But for now, you can go back to those images again and see if you can see how the image quality changes when the aperture goes up. Let me know in the comments down below what you think might be causing that. If you enjoyed this content, leave it a like down below and subscribe to the channel. Really appreciate your support, and check out some of the other content coming down the road if you're interested in learning more about photography. So thanks for joining us here, and see you in the next one.